boxers shake hands before they touch. Now, perhaps that's rather a good example for ambassadors and professors. I'm afraid we shan't give such an entertaining performance as boxers might do, but still, this is a very important and serious occasion. As the ambassador has said, there are one or two other questions which he and I both want to discuss in your presence. The big one, and the first one, is this question of the parallel that I drew in a book that I published in 1954 between what the Nazis did to the European Jews and what the Israelis did to the Palestinian Arabs, which was brought up in one of the questions that were put to me at the meeting the other day in Hillel House. And I answered, yes, I had written that. I said, yes, in the terms in which I had stated it in print in this book of mine, I still held to it. Now, the ambassadors really anticipated one point in telling you very kindly that when I originally made this statement, and when I repeated it the other day, I did say at the same time that I was not making a numerical comparison, because obviously there is no numerical comparison between figures that run into millions and figures that run into 3 or at most 4 figures. The second set of figures I'm talking about, the massacres of Arab civilians behind the lines during the war between the Arab states and the Israeli forces in 1948. Every increase in numbers produces an increase in suffering, but it's impossible to be wicked or criminal more than 100%. Let me put the point bluntly. If I murder one man, that makes me a murderer. I don't have to reach the 1,000 mark or the million mark to be a murderer already. I wonder if there are any Egyptians in the room. I know there are a number of Egyptians in Montreal. Is there any Egyptian present? Perhaps not. Well, let us... let me suppose that some of the Egyptians in Montreal were here at this moment and would say to me, how do you, being an Englishman, defend the slaughter in the fall of 1956 of civilian inhabitants of the Egyptian town of Port Said by bombardment from the air, which ran into 4 figures on the admission of the British government itself, which afterwards sent somebody to investigate, and he couldn't get it down below 4 figures, if I remember right. Now, supposing I have to answer, why, that's not murder, we only kill people up to 4 figures. Now, to be a murderer, you must reach the million mark. Now, those Germans over there, they reached it and they murdered several million people, so they're murderers, but we, the British, we're not murderers. Now, what did you think of that answer? What would Egypt say and what would the world say? Now, I think that applies all round to all cases. Now, the massacres, I must use the word, to which I'm referring, I was not in making this comparison referring to the fighting between the armed forces of the Arab states and the Israeli forces. The situation was, as you know, that the Arab states from outside Palestine did make war on Israel. I do not defend that. And at that time, what is now the territory of Israel was inhabited by the local Arab population, that had been there for many centuries, and by the Israelis who'd come in since 1917. The victims were the local Palestinian Arab population. Now, we come to this point of morality. I utterly agree with the ambassador that this is the essential point, and the point which concerns the future as well as the past. Now, I've mentioned a case that's painful to me to mention, this British case in 1956, to show that I can look at the things my own country has done as well as what other people have done. But I do think if there's any point in what I've said about the numbers, that in point of morality, some of those massacres by Israeli armed forces in Palestine do compare in, so to speak, moral quality with what the Germans did. What we hate in what the Germans did was it was planned beforehand, carried out cold-bloodedly with tremendous cruelty, and with a purpose. Now, I'm afraid I know that all those points applied to the massacres which in numbers don't compare, but I think in quality do compare with what the Nazis did. Anyway, by certain Israeli armed forces, the Stern Gang, for instance, and the Irgun. I don't know how far the Haganah was also implicated. I've heard it stated, and I've never heard it denied, that after at least one of those massacres, that of the civilian population of all sexes and ages at Deir Yassin to the west of Jerusalem, the Israeli armed forces went round in cars with loudspeakers, speaking in Arabic, and said, we have done this to people of this place. You don't want that to happen to you, get out. Now, every civilian population that is in a war zone or is in danger of death very wisely does get out. Happily, after Hitler came to power in Germany, a minority, unfortunately only a minority, of the Jews in Germany did manage to, with difficulty often, to leave Germany in time. Now, the Germans, they couldn't take their lives any longer, but they could and did take and seize and hold their property. No one thinks that where the European Jews who got out of Germany at that time forfeited their legal right to their property as a result of having managed by prudence and foresight to save their lives and their families' lives by getting out in time. If we take another case, in 1940, when the Germans invaded France, several million French people from northern France fled from northern France to the south, for the same reason that the Arab population of the war zone in Palestine in 1948 fled from Palestine. No one, I think, would dream of saying that by flying, as all civilian populations do try to fly from a war zone, those French people forfeited their title to their land, property, houses, and so on in northern France. And if the Germans were to put in a claim today, as we invaded the country and these French people were ill-advised enough to run away, we have a legal title to this property, and it's really rather a shame and illegal that we don't possess it now. That would seem pretty fantastic. But as you will realize, the position in Israel today is that by far the larger part, I suppose, of the land in Israel is legally still the property of that civilian Arab population of Palestine, which fled from Palestine during the war between the Arab states outside Palestine and the Israelis. The property that does rightfully belong to the Israelis is the property that they bought during the 30 years of the Mandate, and long before that. I think if I'm right, the first agricultural Jewish settlements in Palestine go back to the 1880s, the Rothschild settlements. Now, they paid a very handsome price very often for that land, and that land is obviously not only legally but morally and fairly their property. But it's, if I'm right in my figures, a smallish proportion of the total land in the area now held by Israel, by far the larger proportion, and also the houses, movable property, fruit trees and so on, is still the rightful property of the Palestinian refugees who are now living outside their homes, or often within sight of them, and are living under conditions of misery and at present of hopelessness. Let me now make a general point, which concerns not Arab human nature or Jewish human nature, but I'm afraid human nature of all of us. And as I say, of all of us, let me begin again with my own country. In the Second World War, the civilian population in my country, Britain, was severely bombed. What did we do within 11 years of that? The end of the war was 45. In 1956, we bombed in an aggressive attack on Egypt without declaration of war and condemned by the world having done it. We bombed the civilian population of particularly Port Said, to some extent to Cairo, I think, as well, and slaughtered certainly more than 1,000 innocent people. Probably rather more than were slaughtered in those massacres by the Israeli armed forces in 48 of Palestinian Arab civilians during the war between the Israelis and the Arab states. This is a tragedy of human nature. What is the real tragedy is that people who have suffered a thing and have had experience of it should inflict that suffering on other people. because the human imagination is a very sluggish thing, and it's very hard to realize at second hand what it means to suffer these things. But of course, the British people, just during one war, they suffered this bombardment just for a few years. The Jewish people have suffered murder, robbery, expulsion from their homes, not just for a year or two, but for centuries, running into about 2,500 years, shall we say. The more experience one has of what this means, I would say, the more it is morally incumbent on one not to do the same thing again. The temptation to work it off once exasperated is no doubt greater, but the moral duty to resist that temptation is at its maximum. One curious feature about the effect of this comparison I've made, I've been surprised at the vehemence of the reaction to it in the Jewish community. I've wondered myself why, when it is felt to be rather a preposterous comparison, as you obviously feel it to be, you haven't said, here's a silly man saying a silly thing, why bother about it? It's so silly, leave it alone. But the reaction has not been like that. It's been, as we know, very vigorous. I think here I'm going to say a rather controversial thing, that any psychologist would tell you the reason. I would say that rather inadvertently, in this comparison I've drawn, I have given the Jewish people a piece of what psychologists call shock treatment. I have said aloud in startling words, I think something that your consciences, each of you who belong to the Jewish community of the world, are whispering inside each of you. Now, let my voice fade out for a moment and listen to another voice which I'll quote. I am certain that the world will judge the Jewish state by what it will do with the Arabs. Now, as I say, those aren't my words. They're the words of a man famous in all your minds, Chaim Weizmann, whom I had the honor to know when I was a young man, who was the first president of Israel. And they were spoken, I believe, or written in 1949, after the war between the Arab states and Israel, and when Dr. Weizmann was the first president of Israel. But I would ask you, don't let my voice fade out, let even Dr. Weizmann's voice fade out, and listen to your own inner voice inside each of you. Because after all, who was it who were the first to wake up the human conscience? I would say it was the prophets of Israel and Judah. I do not believe that any person of Jewish religion can ever escape from his own conscience. And what's more, I don't believe any Jew ever wishes to escape from his own conscience. And I believe it has been the glory of the Jews since the time of the prophets and perhaps before, that in all controversial questions between Jews or between Jews and the rest of the world, there have always been Jews who have had the spiritual insight and the moral courage to stand up and criticize their people. We shouldn't know what the criticisms of the Jews in the 8th and 7th centuries BC were if we hadn't got the writings of Jewish critics who had criticized them. And so I would leave you with your own consciences and with the existence of these Arab refugees who now number 900,000, because many children have been born in exile. So, as I say, I leave it to you to think over in your own consciences what is to be done about this situation, because we have opened a problem and we have not yet solved it.